Good. Hi, everyone. I know there are still people coming in, but it is 4. It is actually, it's 4:01, so I can start. Good. Welcome to this Four Pees Café, and I think this is the first Four Pees Café of 2022. I have to say that correctly. So a very happy 2022 to all of you. We're still January, so I can still say it. I would wish you everything you want, but if you get everything you want, the rest of the year is going to be very boring. So most of the things you want. I don't have a presentation today. This is a bit experimental. I am also very happy that Ulrich from Callas is here as well. So if I get stuck, I have a secret support line I can call on. But the goal of today was to talk about imposition, and more specifically the new JavaScript-based imposition capabilities in pdfToolbox 13. Now, we did a session about that at the introduction event for pdfToolbox 13. That session is on YouTube in the Callas software channel, so you can go there and you can review that. And I think, if I remember correctly, but it's a long time ago and there were a lot of sessions, if I remember correctly, I played it very safe during that session, and I mostly just talked and showed a presentation. That sounded too easy, so today I want to do something else. I could have just redone this presentation, but that would be too easy altogether. So I thought we would do something else today. I invite you to unmute yourself and participate if you feel like it, either to help me or to ask difficult questions. I will be happier with one than with the other. The goal that I have today is to explain the new stuff that you have in this, well, it's not a real new imposition engine, but the new way of driving the imposition engine using JavaScript. So my goal is to build a configuration from scratch. Yeah? I haven't really practiced that all that much ahead of time, so we'll see. And so just to set the scene, I'm sure you still remember from the presentation, but I will say it anyway, that the imposition engine by itself has not really changed, but the interface to the imposition engine has changed, if you want. And interface not in the sense of user interface, but the, I call it API, the way you talk, the way you set it up. Traditionally in pdfToolbox, you had and you still have an imposition engine that is configured with 2 configuration files. One of which, and you see the impose part of the switchboard on screen here. One part is the imposition scheme, or if you would look at the file itself, the .run list file. The other part is the sheet configuration. If you look at the file for it, it's a .sheet config file. Those were the 2 files that you needed to set up an imposition. And they are both using, or they were both using, a tab delimited text format. If you've ever used it, it will be very familiar, and you've probably swore at it a couple of times because it's very easy to get it wrong. But essentially, you have text, and then the text either starts with a pound sign, and if so, it's a comment. If it doesn't, then it has to be tab delimited, and then you have certain keywords that you have to use. What changed in pdfToolbox 13 is a couple of things. And the first one you already see on screen. The first is that instead of having to open these files in a third-party editor like Visual Studio Code or something else you like, you can now edit these configuration files inside of pdfToolbox. So that's already one change. And if I take an old style run list, for example, and I say edit, then I get an editor that even does color coding and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's one change. The second change is that you're not limited anymore to the old style configuration files. Instead, you can use JavaScript. And the way that has been implemented is that the run list file now gives you a choice between old style run lists, which are still supported and they will remain supported. So old style run lists or new style run lists. And the new style is JavaScript based. And that's what we're going to play with today. Some additional points that are important, like I already said, the existing file formats for imposition are not going to disappear. They are there, they still work, they work in the same way as they worked before, and there is no expectation that those are going to be discontinued anytime soon, if at all. So if you rely on old style imposition, or you really like writing lines with lots of tabs in it and stuff like that, rest assured, you can continue doing that. So that's the good news. The second thing is that the sheet configuration by itself has not really changed. And so we'll start with that one, but it has changed in a way, but we'll get to that. So let me create a new one just for this demo. The goal was to start everything from scratch. So I'm going to do exactly that. And if I say new sheet configuration, I have something where I can enter a name. So I could call this FP Café. Doesn't matter what's in the name. And then now I have a choice. In this new world where I can use JavaScript, I now have a choice. The first thing I can do is I can leave this sheet configuration completely empty. And in that case, all the work will be done in the run list and in my JavaScript in the run list. So the creation of the sheets, the sheet definitions, the slots that I want to use, all of these things will be done in JavaScript then. I can, however, still use the old style sheet config. So I could enter all the things that you know from before. I can have a sheet definition or multiple sheet definitions. I can have slots in here and so on. If you do that, then the sheets that you define here and the slots that you define here will be available on the JavaScript side, and you can just use them. But you don't have to. And it's boring if we do it here, because then we don't have that much to do in JavaScript, so I'm not going to do it here. So what we have is the minimum, and is actually good enough. I have something that has a name, and everything else doesn't really interest me all that much, so I'm just going to save it, and that becomes my sheet configuration. What this implies, and that's important, is that you still need two files to do an imposition. You always need a sheet config and a run list file, but the sheet config can be empty now if you plan to do all the work in JavaScript. So that's the first part done. Like I said before, if you have questions, please interrupt. I won't mind at all. That's one. The second thing that we need to do, of course, is now we need to also create a run list file. And same thing, I can create that by doing new. And what you will see here, let me give it a name, and I'm just going to use the same name as the sheet configuration that I created before. What you will see now is that now I have a choice. I have run list, which is the old style language, or I have JavaScript, and in that case, I'm using the new JavaScript extensions to create my my run list file. So I can close that, and now I have two empty files. And if I try to run it now, I'm going to get an error because, well, it kind of makes sense. So let's do that. Could not impose. Why? The run list created an empty sheet list. That was to be expected. I don't have a sheet config, so no setup of any type of sheet. And I don't have a run list that creates anything. So pdfToolbox rightly tells me that I'm a moron and I didn't put anything in here that creates sheets. So what do you want from me? Okay, so we need to put JavaScript in there. And the next question is, how do we know, or how do you know? Because I'm supposed to know. How do you know what to put in that run list now? And I do want to show that as well. And let me see if I can, yeah, I already did that. So what I did was I went to help.calasoftware.com. You can also go there on the Calas site by doing support and then online documentation. And now the only tricky bit is that, as you know, there is always a library, a manual called Calas pdfToolbox that has the full documentation of all the features in pdfToolbox. But there is also always a separate library, separate manual. I don't know why I keep going back to libraries. There's always a separate manual that is describing the new functionality in the latest version of the product. So as pdfToolbox 13 was the last thing that was released for pdfToolbox, then in that manual, you have an overview of the things that were added or new. And one of those, the last one in here, is the JavaScript-based imposition run lists. What you can expect as we get to pdfToolbox 14 and so on, and no, this is not a product announcement, but as the product evolves, this will be merged in the regular pdfToolbox manual together with the rest of the imposition explanation. If you go to that, you will see 4 articles, the first 2 of which unfortunately somehow became German. And no, I did not write them in German. There must have been a mix-up somewhere, so that will be corrected. Luckily, we don't need those at the moment because they contain the information that I'm telling you right now. So if you listen to what I say, you don't have to learn German. Trust me, it's easier to listen to me than to learn German. The last 2 articles are important, and this is what we're going to use to create the imposition configuration. And actually, the last one is where I'm going to start. That is the convenience functions. So the idea in this new imposition configuration is that you start with an impose call. You create an impose object, and that impose object is where you're going to define sheets and slots and everything else. Yeah? And then you have to pass that back to pdfToolbox. So we're certainly going to need that, and you can see that there are 2 ways to create that, and I will use the second one because I want to show one of the very useful defaults in there. But this is how we're going to start, and then we need to give that back to pdfToolbox. The reason I wanted to go to the documentation is to tell you that this last article in here gives you all the utility functions that you can use, and those are important because they will make our life very easy. And then the other article that you have in here, which is, why did it go back there? That's not what I wanted. I wanted this article. So the other article will tell me the definition of all the different objects that I need as properties in multiple places. And so because we're building this from scratch and my memory is not very good, I am getting older, I will do exactly the same thing as you would normally do when you write this, and that is referring back to the documentation if we need something, and hopefully together we will get to the point that we have a working imposition configuration. So let's take a look. We said that the first thing that we need to do is define an imposition object. And so the imposition object can be created by doing a new call. So let's do that. I want to edit this, and then, so let's, this can be const. We're not going to change the object. Well, we're going to change the yeah, it's difficult. It can be const. We need something, and what I have done so far is just call that imposition, and then we're going to say new impose. Yeah. And so in JavaScript, this means there is someone who has defined an impose object, and we want to create one. Someone, probably Ulrich, at some point in the code defined an impose object, and what we're saying is we want one of those. This impose object is what we then want to return to pdfToolbox at the end. That is also the result that we need to return. And so that means that somewhere at the end of our code, we need to tell pdfToolbox that this is what it should look at. And we're not in a function, so we can't do a return. We just want the result of this whole script to be that imposition object. And we can do that quite easily by just putting that object on a line, and the result thereof is the object. So also want some explanation with that. This actually gives pdfToolbox what it needs to do the imposition. So we're good. That's cool. We defined an imposition object, and now if we run it, of course, we still get the same error, because it still says that the run list created an empty sheet list. That's to be expected. We're creating an imposition object, and we're not creating any sheets. So nothing out of the ordinary. So let's see. We go back to the documentation, and we see what we have here. Then there is a function that is called addSheet, and addSheet lets me define a sheet. And you can see the definition here. I'm going to get back an ID of that sheet. And all I need to do is call addSheet. If you're wondering why the documentation follows my convention of using imposition, that's because I wrote this part of the documentation. So at least I'm consistent. So this function here, addSheet, creates a sheet for me. However, the problem is I need to give it a sheet definition ID, and we don't have that yet. So we probably need to create a sheet definition first. And if you go up a little bit in that article, you'll see that there is, in fact, a function called addSheetDef, and that one allows me to create a sheet definition. If you want to relate this back to the old style, configurations. Sorry, I was reading a question and I can't multitask. I shouldn't do that. If you want to relate to the old style imposition configuration and the sheet configuration that you have there, the sheet line that you have in a sheet config in the old style stuff, that corresponds to the creation of a sheet definition. If you remember, the way that was done is you have the keyword sheet, and then you specify the width and the height of the sheet. Well, that corresponds to what you need to do here. The function is called addSheetDef. I need to specify a width and a height and potentially a unit. Now, there's a few things here. First of all, how do I know what this unit is if I want to set it? And if I have a width and a height and I don't specify a unit, what is going to happen then? Because it might be useful. I mean, the less you type, the easier. So it would be nice to use this sheet definition without units, but then the question is, what happens? Is this then always in point, or what's going on? Well, what happens is that in this defaults object, I told you that we created an impose and we can specify a defaults object here. we can do what we typed so far, but we can also specify a defaults object. In that defaults object, you can have a property called unit, and that can be set to the unit that you want to use wherever you don't override the unit in a function itself. Yeah. If I don't set it, it is point, but be honest, who likes to deal with points? No one. So what I can do is I can look at the other article, and actually I should probably open both of them. That would be easier. So let me open the functions one, and here we'll go to the objects one. Yeah. So if I look in the object definitions article, you'll be able to see that a unit is defined by a string, and that string can be a wide variety of things. And given that I am in Ghent, Belgium, I'm going to use millimeter. That seems to make sense. In the meantime, let me answer the question that appeared in chat. And if you have your own questions, please, like I said, speak up or put them in chat. The question there was, is there a way to convert old style run lists into new style run lists? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Unfortunately and fortunately, I think the way that the new style run lists work and the things you can do there are sufficiently different that you want to think about how you're going to set that up anyway. So it wouldn't really make a lot of sense to automatically try to convert an old style run list to a new style run list. You'll have to take the hard way and start from scratch. So, or take an example and modify it, obviously. So let's see if we understood this. And the first thing is I used the simple impose object creation. And like I said, I would like to work in millimeter throughout my my configuration here. And so it would be really nice to be to have that as a default. And what the documentation says is I can have an object in here. And now you can write this in different ways. I'm going to write what is the what perhaps to you looks not the most user-friendly, but I would advise you to get used to this kind of notation because you'll see it very often if you start doing JavaScript, especially new style JavaScript. So what I've done here is I'm still calling the impose function, but now I'm also passing it an object. And this object at the moment is empty. That is, of course, not what we want. The documentation said that this defaults object can have a property called unit. And so we'll see whether that is correct. It can have a property called unit. I get an error here because a property is supposed to have a value. So pdfToolbox is complaining, but that's normal. I just need to specify the value. And I want millimeter. And so I'm going to add a string, and the string is millimeter. You could put a comma on here. Strictly speaking, you shouldn't, but normally it is supported in JavaScript now as well. So now I'm creating this, I'm still creating this imposition object, but instead of getting all of the defaults, I now will get a default unit that says millimeter. Yeah. So we don't have to worry about passing units in any other function. As long as we want to work in millimeter, that's what we're going to get. Okay, that's one step. The second thing that we saw was this sheet creation, and then we concluded that we need a sheet definition first. So we're going to need this add sheet def function. And remember that we don't need the unit anymore, so we actually need this variant of that. And as you can see, I need to pass a width and I need to pass a height. Okay. So I can take my object and then say add sheet def, and I need a width and a height. I'm going to make it very easy for myself, and I'm going to say 297 and 210. So a width of 297 millimeter, a height of 210 millimeter. That is, of course, as all Europeans at least will know, the landscape version of A4. Okay. Now, what is important is that I'm adding this sheet definition, and pdfToolbox is going to give me an ID that I can later reuse to specify that sheet definition. Okay. And I need to remember that. So const sheet ID, sheet definition ID. I should write it properly because otherwise we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot later. Yeah. And what this does is create the sheet definition. One of the confusing things when you do this for the first time, trust me, I understand. I did it for the first time myself. I actually did it without documentation, so that's even more fun. One of the confusing things is that you have to remember that you need to create a sheet definition first, and only after you have a sheet definition, you can create a sheet. And so you're going to get a lot of IDs from pdfToolbox that you later need, and giving these IDs a proper name in your JavaScript is going to help you a lot. And my OCD says that I should probably have a comment for the first line as well if I'm going to have comments for everything else. There we go. So we're calling the add sheet def function that gives me a sheet definition, and I'm remembering the ID. Okay, so is that good enough to get us where we want? It shouldn't, because we've created a sheet definition. We haven't created a sheet yet. So our sheet list is still empty. So what we need to do is also add the next step, and that is we need to say, use the sheet definition to create sheets. Now, you could create one sheet or multiple sheets. It doesn't really matter. We could say 0. Yeah, 0 should index smaller. How many sheets do we want? 0, 1, 1. Yeah, so we should get 2 if we do this. And then index. So we're going to make it a little bit more interesting by just not creating one sheet, but we're going to make a loop so we can create multiple sheets. Okay, how do we create a sheet? We've already seen that in the documentation as well. If you don't remember, you can refer back to it. It says, and there are only 5 or 6 different calls that you're going to need. So once you get the hang of it, it is not really that difficult. But if we want to add a sheet, it says call the function add sheet, and the only thing you have to specify is the sheet definition. Why is that sufficient? Well, again, it's exactly the same as the old style configuration. There you created a sheet, and then you created a sheet definition, sorry, and then you create sheets from it. Here it is exactly the same. We've created a sheet definition, and now we're going to create the sheets. So how do we do that? We say const sheet ID, because now we're creating a sheet. Sheet ID is, and then what do we need? We need imposition, and then we need add sheets. And what we needed to pass is this sheet definition ID. Yeah. Now, what you can see is the fact that this is done in 2 separate functions means that, well, first of all, I could define multiple sheet definition ideas, and I can show you that in a second, but I can define as many as I want. Again, in the old style configs, you could do that as well. You could have one line that said sheet, or you could have multiple. So I can create as many sheet definitions as I want. And then in here, I can choose which sheet definition I want to use. So if you want to do something where you impose on different sizes, that is absolutely possible. The only thing you have to do is you have to create multiple sheet definitions, remember them properly in a variable somehow, and then when you do add sheet, you use the definition, the sheet sizes that you want to use at that point in your imposition configuration. Okay. Let's say okay. Let's see whether we made any mistakes with that. So execute. There. What just happened? Well, what just happened was that I created 2 sheets. Yeah? So we got that bit sorted. I created 2 sheets. Both of them are empty because I didn't put anything on them, but both of them are in fact 297 by 210. So pdfToolbox did exactly what I asked it to do. So what I said before is, and let me give that as a modification. So sheet definition, this was, we agreed that this was landscape, at least I agreed with myself that this was landscape. What I just said is we can create as many of these as one. So I could create one, sorry, 97. And then this one would be a portrait version. What I could easily do now is create different sheets. And for the first one, I can say it has to be landscape, and the second one has to be portrait. And then I probably also need to change this. So sheet, I'll keep ID, sheet ID, landscape, and the second one we'll call portrait. This is still going to work. I'm just defining 2 different sizes now. They happen to be landscape and portrait, but they can be anything. Also, I can define as many of them as I want. It's not a problem. And I'm creating 2 sheets, one that will be landscape and the second one that will be portrait. If I run this, I should end up with 4 pages because I have a loop that runs twice, and each time that I go through the loop, I create 2 sheets. So I would expect to end up with 4 pages. So 1 landscape, 1 portrait, 1 landscape, 1 portrait. I love it when what happens is what I expect. That is not always the case. So, so far we're still in agreement. So create a, actually what I'm doing here is create a landscape sheet, and I could say the same thing here, but this is a portrait sheet. Now, empty sheets are kind of boring. So how do you put stuff on a sheet? Well, in the old style configurations, if you remember, you would set up sheets in the sheet config by having this line that starts with sheet. And then you would have lines starting with slot, and then a long array of a long list of values. And the values would define the size of the slots and the bleed, and whether you want trim marks or not, and whether you want to rotate the content or not, and scale the content or not. So all of these things were specified there. That was a slot definition. Of course, here we need exactly the same thing. We need to define slots, and once we have slots, we can put stuff in them. Yeah. How do you define the slots? Again, we go back to the documentation, and as you can imagine, there is a utility function called add slot. And let's see what we need. We need a sheet definition ID, and we need a slot definition. Why do we need a sheet definition ID? Again, this is like the old times. When you defined a slot, you also said on which sheet definition that particular slot should appear. And here we do the same thing. So we set up a sheet definition, and then we define for that sheet def, we define what slots we have. So this is the ID of the sheet definition, not the sheet definition that you want to add this to. What is slot definition? Slot definition is an object. And so we would need to look in the second article with the objects to find out what we need to put in there. But let's start with adding the slot itself. So I'm not going to do that in my loop. Actually, I can do this wherever I want, and each time I call it, it would create a new slot. But it does, of course, make sense to put that together with your sheet definitions, because they are going to be linked to that. So I could say slots, and I'm going to call it landscape, and maybe we have more, so I'm just going to call it 1. And that is in position, add slots. We needed the sheet definition ID, which is what we got here when we created that definition. And again, I need an object with stuff. And so this gives me an object. And now the question becomes, what do you put in here? We can imagine that probably what you can put there is all the same stuff that you could put in a slot definition old style. All the things I mentioned, like the size and the position and the bleed and the trim marks and so on. The question is, what are the properties? Just as here, you have to know that the property is called unit, and you have to know what value you can put in there. This is the same here. I have to know which properties I can specify. And then once I know that, I have to know what their value is, the correct value. If I make a mistake here, it's either going to be ignored or I'm going to get an error. So I could make a property called penguin and then do something, but pdfToolbox is probably not going to be amused and it's going to ignore it. So go back to the documentation. And now I need to look as well, but there should be something here that defines what I want here. Slot definition. That suspiciously sounds like what we need. So what does it say? The slot definition, we already know it's an object. And here it says all of the properties. Yeah. And then for each property, it tells you what the value is. And in some cases, that will be a simple value like a Boolean or a string. And then this is just JavaScript. So we know that if the property is a Boolean, I can have true or false, and that's it. In other cases, it is more complex. And we're going to start with something that is really, really basic. And that would be, where is this slot? And the property for that is called rect. Okay. And then you can see that we need to define a rectangle for that. So let's start with the basics. My property is called rect. And then I need a rectangle. And so now I need to go look at where the rectangle is defined. I could search, but I'm sure I'm going to find it here. Rectangle is an object. Good. That's more information that we need. So it's not a string or something else. It is an object. What properties does this rect thing have? And now I have a choice, and this is actually quite nice. It's something that we didn't have in the old style stuff, and sometimes it's pretty convenient. I can either specify the left-hand side, the bottom, the right, and the top, or I can define the left-hand side and the bottom, and then the width and the height. And if I define width and height, the right and the top is going to be calculated by pdfToolbox automatically. I can also specify a unit. So my default unit is millimeter. I set that up at the beginning of my script. But if I wanted, for whatever reason, to define this rectangle in inch, then I could easily do that by adding a unit, a property to this object and specifying inch for that. Yeah, that would work. That's not what I want. I just want to use millimeter. And so I need to specify, for example, left, bottom, width, and height. How do I do that? Well, they are properties. So I need a property called left. And then here I need a value. I'm going to say 10. Remember, this is 10 millimeter. I need a property called bottom. I'm also going to say 10. I don't know why I put a tab in here. I'm too used to the old style imposition stuff where you have to do tabs everywhere. But this is JavaScript. I don't need it anymore. So left and bottom is 10. So essentially our slot starts at 10 millimeter from the bottom left corner of the sheet. And then, because I don't want to calculate, I'm going to say width and height. And we're going to make our life easy. And I'm going to use this as a, I don't know, a legend or a mark if you want. And so I'm going to say that I want it to be 50 millimeter wide and 10 millimeter high. So I'm not intending to put a page in here. I'm intending to use this to put some text in there so I can show some other stuff. So this is a slot definition. I've only defined the rectangle. And actually, unless I'm very mistaken, this should be sufficient. Everything else, I can simply use the default values. I might not like the default values, and then I will need to add some more properties. But for now, I'm going to go with this. Okay, so I have a slot here. This is a slot on the landscape. So I'm going to add this here. And we want to put something in there now because we added the slots to my definition, but it's still empty. How do we put something in there? And I said I was going to use it for text. I'm assuming if I go to documentation that there will be something for that. And yes, there is something called add text. Okay. How does that work? I have my imposition object. I call the add text. I specify the sheet ID, the slot ID, and then the text. Okay, so position, add text. The sheet ID is this one. If you're confused now, remember this is the sheet ID, not the sheet definition ID. You don't need the sheet definition ID because when I specify a slot, that slot is linked to the sheet definition ID already. So pdfToolbox knows what it is anyway. It doesn't matter. But I need the slot ID here. Slot landscape 1, and then I need the value. Now, what is really nice in the fact that this is JavaScript is that this is the normal JavaScript environment that you've known in pdfToolbox for a while now. And that means that I also have access to all of the other JavaScript stuff. And do we already have? Yes. Okay, cool. I'm saying cool because this was not here at some point in one beta version or whatever, and it's annoying. But what do I mean with this is normal JavaScript environment? Well, what I mean is that I can insert other things that I know from the document through the JavaScript interface. And so I can say, I want something with the, maybe I want to add the name of the document. Yeah, well, I have something that is called app.doc.document file name, and that gives me the full, the file name of the current PDF document. So let's insert that in there. Given that, as I said, that this is linked to the JavaScript environment, it becomes much more easy to get information from the active document and to work that into the imposition that you are doing. And so this is just a small example, but this should actually suffice. I'm adding text, I'm adding it to the sheet that I just created. I am adding it into the slot that I added to that, the definition of that. And what I want to add is the file name of the document. Let's see whether we succeed with that. So there's the name of the document. That's what I expected. I also expect the next sheet to be empty because I didn't add a slot there. So that one is empty. I expect the next one to be have the name again because, well, it's the same as the first one. So 4 pages, and indeed the slot was added as I expected. So that is good for text. I want to do one other thing here. And I also want to, of course, add a page to there. That is essentially why you use imposition. How do I do that? Same thing. I have a function called add page, and by now you start to understand what the deal is. I need a sheet ID. I need a slot ID that is identical to add text, so that is not surprising. And I need a page index. And the page index is 0 based. So if I want to add the first page of the document, then I need to specify 0. Okay, now remember that I don't have a slot for this yet. We created a slot for the text. I don't have a slot yet for the page. So I'm just going to duplicate that. We'll call this slot 2 on the landscape page. It is for the landscape sheet definition. That is okay. And I would better modify my rectangle a little bit, or it's going to overlap. So I could say 20 as the bottom value, and that should actually do it pretty well. That will place it just above my text. And then the width and the height, well, I don't know what my document is exactly. Actually, I do, because it's at the bottom of my window there. But I'm just going to give it a 100 millimeter width and height, and that should work. So now we have a slot, and that means that, and I'm also going to copy this one. We're not going to do add text, we're going to do add page. And we don't need to add text, we need to add a page. And in this case, value 0 will give me the first page of my document. Remember, again, we are in the JavaScript environment. So if at some point, and I'm not going to need it now, but if at some point you want to know how many pages you have in your incoming document, then I could refer to, is it num pages? I think so. I have to look it up. Let's make sure. Num pages. Yeah, so I can use this, and that would give me the number of pages, not in the imposed file, of course, but in the file that I am imposing in the input document. And in this case, I only have 1 page, so num pages would be 1. So if you want to create an imposition configuration that, for example, places all of the pages of the incoming document on a sheet, then you can use num pages to see how many you have, perhaps divide it over multiple sheets, or calculate how much space you have for each of them. That is a possibility. You could do some of these things in the old style configuration setup, but it was much more difficult. Here it is much easier. So did we do that properly? I added text, I added that. No, we need to have slot number 2. It's a good catch. And then the page, and that should be it. Do we feel adventurous? Yes, there we go. Yeah. And again, I only put this slot on my landscape sheet definition. So it's only going to be added there. Yeah. My portrait page is still empty because I didn't put anything there. Okay. There is there's of course a little bit more that you can do with this. I added a minimal slot in here because that's what I wanted to show, how to add these things. But if we go to slot definitions, you can see that there are a bunch of additional parameters. I have something called isolated and clip mode that talk about properties of the slot itself. I have crop marks that allows you to specify which marks you might want around this. I have the text specification that says if you're placing text, what type of text and the font and the size. Bleed that allows you to specify how much bleed you want around the four edges, the scale and the rotation. And then a binding margin and shingling. If you don't know what shingling is and you want to find out, then I'm not going to talk about it here. Shingling, well, it's something that is valid for bound impositions. If you want to know, there is a separate documentation article that talks about shingling in much more detail. There are some new capabilities in pdfToolbox 13. That same video I referred you to on YouTube in the Kala Software channel also talks about the new shingling capabilities. So you can read about that there. But I can add all of these things in there. So if I want to modify how this is done, maybe I want to scale what is being placed, then the only thing I have to do is I have to go to my slot definition. So here I have a rectangle, and then I could say scale, and then I'm guessing if I put 0.5 there, that it should actually be half the size. Yeah. Actually, it's a good question. I don't know. Should it be 50 or 0.5? We'll find out. Yeah. So when I run that, I'm guessing it has to be 50. See, that's what happens if you try this from scratch. In the old style, it was 100 for one-on-one, so then it would be logical that it should be 50 for half the size. And if anything, pdfToolbox is always logical, so it has to be 50. Yeah. So if you want to modify the slots, so much for pdfToolbox, I think that is nice. If you want to modify a slot, the only thing you have to do is to add additional parameters to there, properties to there, and then it will modify what exactly happens in that. Yeah. So to recap, we're also almost at 1 hour, so that's not a bad guess. To recap, you will have to start by creating an impose object. If you watch this video that I talked about a couple times now, you'll see that there are actually 2 things you can do after that. I'm only showing you what I think is the easiest one, where we use convenience methods to do the rest, and I think you should do that as well. But you have to start by creating an impose object. You can specify some defaults there. The most important one is the unit default that tells pdfToolbox for any number that you're passing it afterwards, what the unit of that number is. And then you have to use these convenience methods, creating 1 or more sheet definitions, adding 1 or more slots to those sheet definitions, and then creating sheets and adding information to the slots on those sheets as necessary. And of course, it's not because you create a sheet. It's not because you create a sheet that you have to put a slot on it. If you don't, then it's just empty. It's not because you define a slot that you have to use it. So I could remove this add page and leave the slot there. That's going to work just fine. It's an empty slot. Empty slot is empty. But if you want to put something on there, you have to create a slot for it. Important, as I've said before now, and I want to go a little bit further now, is that important is that this has been built into the existing JavaScript infrastructure. So you can use all of the app and app.doc and all the other possibilities you have in that infrastructure. So use that to your advantage. And the other thing that is important, if you're migrating from old style imposition to new style imposition, is that one of the most difficult things perhaps in the old style imposition is the way that the logic worked with loops and so on. And the fact that an imposition configuration would run in a loop until first page was larger than last page or something like that. Yeah, so you had to make sure that these built-in variables, first page and last page, were changed in each loop, and that at some point, first page became larger and then it would stop. So you had this whole built-in logic with an automatic repetition and stuff like that. This is not what happens here. You can forget about all that. You're just using JavaScript. You build all the logic that you want in JavaScript. The other thing to remember is that you're not actually doing imposition while you're doing this. The only thing you're doing is you're putting stuff in that impose object. And if you would look at the impose object, once you get here, you would see that it would have now properties that hold the sheet definitions and the sheets and the slots and so on and so on. So you're just building a more and more complex object by using these convenience methods. The actual imposition work happens once you pass this to pdfToolbox, and pdfToolbox then interprets that object and does what you asked in it. Yeah? So everything you do here is just JavaScript, and the goal is to build that object. And that means that doing things like looping and then creating sheets and slots or putting stuff in slots on the fly and so on is completely okay. That's all fine. Yeah? You just have to make sure it's correct JavaScript, and that when you add properties that pdfToolbox cares about, that what you put in that property is also something it understands. So if I add rect and the value is penguin, I'm going to get slapped because that's not something that is understood. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to tempt my luck to make it much more complex. I'm already surprised that I got this far and it still works from the first try, so that is good. If you build this yourself, one of these documentation articles also has an example that you can start from, so you don't have to start from scratch if you don't want to. But in general, remember that you have one article in here that talks about all of the functions that you can use, and that actually also has some of the explanation in between. So that is one that you need to keep close. And then the other one that you're going to need is the one that talks about the object definitions, because that defines all the objects and the names of the properties and what the value should be for these convenience functions. And with these two articles together, you should be able to make it. What I told people in when I did training for the old style imposition configurations was do it bit by bit. So add something and try it. Actually, my advice for the new style stuff is more or less the same. Yeah? It is a little bit easier, and I've already noticed, I've already used the new stuff in some projects. I've noticed that it goes a lot quicker because it's JavaScript and you're not tripped up by the ancient syntax of the old style configuration. So that makes it a lot easier, but build it in pieces, test it. It is very quick to test. So make sure to test it. At least you will know very quickly when a function that you added or some logic that you added doesn't work. That will make it much easier to correct. But if you have any experience with development, that shouldn't be new advice. That is true for most development projects. And it's exactly 5 o'clock. So if there are any questions, then now would be a good time. Let me see if there are any questions. This is a feature request, but actually I quite like it. So the feature request is, it would be nice to be able to add a border or I guess a fill to a slot, so that you can just create a slot and then you can make it very visible where that slot ends up on the sheet. I guess the feature request would be, can we add either a border color or a border definition or a background color to a slot, and then when you add that, the slot is actually filled in with that background color, for example. You can, Jan, you can consider that to be relayed to Callas. I saw Ulrich write something, so that's not a promise that you're getting it, but at least it got there. Is there a way to store the JS in the file system repo and just load this during runtime? I actually don't think there is an easy way of doing that. So the way that this is set up, and you can check that by going to the library in the preferences of pdfToolbox. What you will see there is there used to be 2 files. cafe.runlist and cafe.sheetconfig. Now you will see 3 files. If you have a JavaScript component, there will be I have to be careful now. There will be a cafe.runlist and a cafe.runlist.js, if I'm correct. Yeah, and so that's where the JavaScript component of this new runlist system is stored. And yes, Sebastian, I agree, it's a pity. But the discussion, I think we should also frame it as a larger topic. There has been a lot of discussion and thinking about how can we take all the configuration files and put them under version control or something like that. So I think what you're asking here is very similar. It just turns out that this is well, 2 things, I think. One, it is not trivial as a topic. That is one. And secondly, unfortunately, there always seem, up to this point, there always seem to be features that were more higher on the list. I will not say that they were more interesting, but they were higher on the list. Yeah. So, but I know that it is a topic that has been discussed. And yes, you could ask the same question for the imposition configuration. One last question. The sample run list is, so I said in the documentation, there is a sample run list. I forget now, here, for example, and I don't know whether it's in every article, but if you look at the objects article that I've used here, then you can already see a download link for an example run list there.
I would like to add something to Seb's question there.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't he asking for how to run it as a profile or a process plan? You export the imposition as an action and then you run it in a process plan.
Store. Yeah, that's not how I understood it, but yes, that could very well be.
Yeah, I just want to use tools like Git to keep tracking of changes. And using the old style configurators, the plain text file, it's quite easy to track changes. And the process plan is a, well, sort of a binary. And it's not nice to put this one into, well, into a working Git construct configuration.
As long as you're talking about an automated setup, you could do it, because there the JavaScript file would just be a file. As long as it's not part of a process plan, then it's just a file and you can do it. Yeah, and you can of course create an action and then specify this imposition config and then put it in a process plan. But yeah, then you end up with a process plan and you're in trouble. But as long as you if on the command line, for example, I haven't checked that, but there should be a way to just run the imposition with a sheet config and a run list. So then you can keep them as individual files, and then you could have them in the repo somewhere.
So as long as you're in desktop application, the JavaScript run list will just be a JavaScript file in the library folder, so that can be maintained in a repository, of course.
Question, Ulrich, and actually something I wondered. I haven't tested it yet, but I have wondered about it. If I make a process plan and my process plan has an action, and the action refers to a JavaScript imposition configuration, and I change the JavaScript bits, that should also change the behavior of the process plan then immediately, right?
Yes, that's the case in the desktop.
In the desktop.
So once you export your process plan to a KFPX file, the JavaScript will be included in that file and can be used in the CLI.
Yeah.
So CLI has no libraries, that's true only for desktop libraries.
Yeah.
There you have the resources, and that are just plain JavaScript files, and you could even open them in an external editor and use test mode. So unfortunately, you currently cannot access that internal folder anymore to make advantage of that feature. But yes,
I know.
Yeah, and in this case, I'm afraid I'm more into the CLI stuff, so won't work.
But it is quite useful if you're building, because normally what I end up doing a lot is building a quite complex process plan, and then one of the steps is an imposition, and then now it's a JavaScript imposition. The fact that you can just edit the JavaScript and then run the process plan again, and you get the stuff that you've changed in the JavaScript, that is quite nice. It makes testing faster.
David, you should show the debugger as well.
Yeah, just one moment. What you can do in a configured imposition action is to use variables for run lists. And once you specify in that variable that you allow a browse button, you will be able to use run lists from that are existing somewhere on the file system, for example. So probably that's something that's interesting for Sebastian.
Okay. But then you have to kind of call them okay. But then, okay, so you would select the location of, you would allow someone to browse to the location of.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Then you could use an external JavaScript run list by using the set variable command line option, for example.
Yeah.
On CLI.
We'll check. Good idea. Thanks.
And debugger, Jan, I haven't actually run the debugger lately because it's JavaScript, and all of a sudden I find that my run list just work as opposed to before.
Yeah, but it's great if you do complicated stuff, or you can see that, especially if you're calling variables from Switch, for example, you can check them and see that they are what you think they should be.
So I switched it on, and then
it's a lot better now since version 12.
So then I have the, this is the definition object that I have done, yeah.
Correctly, so that's what was created by these convenience functions, and you get the JSON object that is interpreted by pdfToolbox to create the actual imposed object.
So if you would watch that that video that we keep talking about, that one explained the two methods. So you can actually skip all the convenience methods and just build an object. And originally I thought, yeah, that's the way to go because that's simple. But it turns out it's much more of a pain to do it. It's much easier to just use the convenience functions. So I was wrong in that.
But in the end, you could just copy the object that is in the debugger and put it into your JavaScript run list and return that, and you should get the same result.
True. So you could actually have a script somewhere else that that defines this whole object, and then only return that object in a JavaScript run list. Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned a couple of times that this is in the JavaScript context. What I didn't mention, but is of course one of the really nice things, is that it also makes it much easier to work with variables that come from somewhere else. You could do that in the old style stuff, but then it was using this environment function, and it was a little bit more tricky to do it. And then once you start doing calculations with them, you got a headache very quickly. Now it's just JavaScript, and you have all the app.vars. You have all the variables automatically that come from somewhere else, and you can use them without any problem. So that's also nice.
Yeah, and you can now even use the ask at runtime dialog that asks for variable values. That was not possible with the old run list. So with old run list, you could not create variables that are entered at runtime.
Correct, and I think what are you thinking about? I have an example, but I'm not going to find it immediately. But yeah, that is also nice because before you could only test a configuration or an imposition setup that used variables by putting it in a process plan and there ask for the variables, and now you can do the app.requires immediately in the imposition script, and that means you can test your work much easier in the desktop as well with that. So, any more questions? I don't think so from what we've put this in here. No, that seems to be all. Very good. So that was it for the JavaScript-based imposition run lists. What we're going to do, is it next week, Sam? I think so. Yeah. So what I'm going to do next week, but this is going to be more challenging, so I might have to do a little preparation for that. I wanted to also cover the second JavaScript-based topic in a little bit more detail in pdfToolbox 13, and that is the ability to create checks or to add conditions to checks using JavaScript. And it's another one of these things where we have covered it in using a video during the introduction event. I would like to do the same thing as I did here, and that is just start completely from scratch, and together with the documentation and the tools that we have, see now how do you build that, because these things are often not that difficult. The problem is, how do you get started with it, and where do you find all the bits and pieces, and what should you watch out for? So that was the purpose of this session, and that will be the next for the next session as well. It is online. You can subscribe for it. Last point: this has been recorded, and it will be added to our YouTube channel shortly. If you have any questions about it, or you try stuff and it doesn't work, simply email support, and either they or I will, depending on how difficult your question is, we'll get back to you and sort it out. Thank you very much for joining the first session of 2022, and I look forward to seeing you at the second session of 2022 next week.